Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of mechanical precision. You know,
absolutely.
like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is.
Right. Broken or not broken, it's clean.
It's clean and it's comforting. But then you step into the world of human reproduction and infertility, and suddenly that x-ray machine is pretty much useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just entirely murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And, that is exactly why when you're studying drug therapy for infertility, you really have to shift your mindset.
Right, away from structural fixes.
Exactly. You shift from structural fixes to biochemical manipulation.
Well, today we are cutting through that murk. If you're a nursing student conquering your pharmacology unit, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is conquering Chapter 66 of Lane's Pharmacology for Nursing Care.
The 12th edition, specifically.
Yes, the 12th edition. We are translating all those dense mechanisms, the heavy-hitting drugs, and the critical safety alerts into the practical reality of what happens when a patient turns to medical science to build a family.
We really need to start by understanding the baseline here. Because when a couple seeks medical help, it's usually after a year of unprotected intercourse without conception.
That's the standard timeline, right?
Right. That is the clinical threshold for infertility, which technically speaking is subfertility-like, a decrease in reproductive capacity. We have to distinguish that from sterility.
Which is the complete inability to reproduce.
Exactly. I mean, the drugs we're going to cover today, they cannot create a reproductive system from scratch. They require existing functional anatomy to actually work with.
And the statistics here are pretty staggering. Infertility affects about 10% of heterosexual cisgender couples trying to conceive.
That's a huge number.
It is. And when they turn to pharmacology, it works about half the time. But the disparity in that success rate is what's really fascinating. Drug therapy for female infertility is highly successful.
Yeah, but drug therapy for male infertility is notoriously ineffective.
It's a stark contrast. But before we can even attempt to tip those odds, you have to find out where the system is failing. Like, you never just guess and hand out a prescription.
No, absolutely not. The diagnostic prerequisite involves a thorough history from both partners. You need a semen analysis. You're assessing tubal patency to ensure the fallopian tubes are open. And you have to confirm whether ovulation is actually occurring.
So if a patient has regular menstrual cycles, do we just assume ovulation is happening?
Generally, yes. We presume ovulation is happening in that case, so we don't necessarily jump straight to drawing estrogen and progesterone levels. We try to locate the breakdown first.
I always picture the female reproductive cycle as this, incredibly complex relay race.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right. You have follicular maturation handing the baton to ovulation, which hands it to transport through the fallopian tubes, then fertilization, the nidation.
Implantation, right?
Right, implantation. And finally, the growth of the conceptus. If just one runner drops the baton, the whole sequence fails. So our pharmacology toolkit is basically designed to coach specific runners.
But to coach them, you have to know why they're failing. I mean, about 25% of the time, the issue is an ovulation. The follicles simply aren't ripening and releasing an egg.
And another barrier is the environment itself, right?
Exactly. In a normal cycle, estrogen makes cervical mucus thin and watery to help sperm travel. But if it's too thick or scant, it acts like a brick wall.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but we can actually treat that specific issue with estrogen.
Then there are the systemic hormonal issues, like hyperprolactinemia accounts for about 7% of cases.
Which is an overproduction of prolactin, sometimes caused by a benign pituitary adenoma.
And that excessive prolactin actively suppresses gonadotropins, which just shuts down estrogen secretion and stops ovulation in its tracks.
Right, and we use dopamine agonists for that. And of course, we have to mention polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, which affects, 5 to 7% of women of reproductive age?
Yeah, something like that. And PCOS is this brilliant example of how interconnected the body's systems are. It's a combined endocrine and metabolic disorder.
Patients typically present with androgen excess, which leads to things like acne and hirsutism, but the underlying driver for many is actually insulin resistance.
And this is where the pharmacology feels almost like a plot twist. If a patient comes into a fertility clinic with PCOS, they might walk out with a prescription for metformin.
A classic type 2 diabetes drug.
Right. It sounds bizarre to hand out a diabetes medication for infertility until you connect the metabolic dots.
It all comes back to the insulin. Metformin increases cellular sensitivity to insulin, which means, the body doesn't have to produce as much of it.
Okay, so by driving down those circulating insulin levels, you indirectly lower the androgen levels.
Exactly. The domino effect of lowering those androgens is restored ovulation and much higher pregnancy rates. It's off-label prescribing, but it's driven entirely by an understanding of the mechanism.
Let's pivot to the other half of the equation for a second, because it feels like we're focusing almost entirely on the female reproductive system.
We are.
So wait, if male factors cause roughly 50% of infertility cases, why does the pharmacology arsenal feel so incredibly one-sided?
It's because male infertility presents a completely different diagnostic wall. Aside from erectile dysfunction, which is a structural or vascular issue, we can treat with drugs like sildenafil.
Right, the well-known ones.
Right. But aside from that, male infertility is overwhelmingly idiopathic. Between 25 and 40% of the time, we simply do not know what's causing the decreased sperm density, or poor motility, or abnormal semen volume.
And obviously, if you don't know the cause, you can't target the mechanism.
Exactly. Empiric treatments like trial and error with androgens or HCG, they almost never work.
Are there any exceptions?
The one rare exception is hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. That's a condition where the brain isn't secreting sufficient gonadotropins, but treating that is an enormous undertaking.
How so?
As a nurse, you have to counsel these patients that therapy with HCG and androgens will take 3 to 4 years, and it's going to be incredibly expensive, both financially and emotionally.
The burden there is just heavy. It makes total sense why the medical field leans so heavily into the female reproductive system, where the hormonal feedback loops are, distinct and manipulatable.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the absolute heavyweights of controlled ovarian stimulation. Let's start with the first-line agent, clomiphene.
Clomiphene is our primary tool to promote follicular maturation, but its mechanism of action is completely counterintuitive. It is literally an anti-estrogen.
Right.
This threw me for a loop when I first read it. Estrogen is the primary hormone driving the female reproductive cycle. Why on earth would blocking it help a patient get pregnant?
It's basically a chemical illusion. Clomiphene binds to the estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and just blocks them.
Okay.
So the brain monitors those receptors, registers zero estrogen, and just hits the panic button. It assumes systemic estrogen levels have plummeted to dangerous lows.
So the brain overcompensates. It aggressively pumps out luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, to fix this fake crisis.
Yes, exactly.
And that massive surge travels to the ovaries and forces the follicles to mature and release an egg. We are basically gaslighting the pituitary gland into doing its job better.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. But you have to think about the anatomical requirement here. For this chemical illusion to work, the pituitary gland and the ovaries must be functional.
Right.
If a patient has primary pituitary failure or their ovaries are exhausted, clomiphene will do absolutely nothing. You can press the gas pedal all you want, but if there's no engine, the car isn't moving.
But in properly selected patients, that engine roars to life. Clomiphene boasts a 90% ovulation rate.
It's very effective.
But tricking the body into thinking it has no estrogen has severe consequences. You're essentially inducing temporary menopause.
You are, and the adverse effects map perfectly to that low estrogen state. Estrogen regulates the body's thermostat, so blocking it triggers severe hot flashes.
Miserable.
Yeah, and patients also experience abdominal discomfort, nausea, bloating, and breast engorgement.
There are also reversible visual disturbances, right? Like blurred vision or visual flashes. As a nurse, you have to proactively warn your patient about this.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if their vision suddenly flashes while they're driving, they'll panic if they don't know it's just the medication.
We also have to counsel them on the likelihood of multiple births.
Yeah.
Because we're surging the ovaries with so much LH and FSH, 8 to 10% of these pregnancies result in twins.
Wow.
And the true irony of clomiphene lies in its mechanism.
Right. Because it's an anti-estrogen, it can actually create the exact hostile environment we mentioned earlier. It forces the cervix to produce scant, thick, highly viscous mucus.
It builds a literal barricade that sperm cannot swim through. Or it can cause a luteal phase defect, meaning the uterine lining never properly thickens to accept an embryo.
So what's the nursing implication there?
In both cases, the nurse should anticipate secondary orders to counteract the clomiphene. We use supplemental estrogen to thin out the cervical mucus, or progesterone to support the uterine lining.
Okay, so clomiphene relies on the pituitary gland. But what if that engine is completely broken? If the brain cannot produce LH and FSH no matter how much you trick it, we can't just abandon the cycle, right?
No, we bypass the brain entirely. We move to direct ovarian stimulation using menotropins and follitropins.
Menotropins, or HMG, are fascinating. This is a 50-50 mixture of FSH and LH that is literally extracted from the urine of postmenopausal cisgender women.
It sounds wild, but the biology behind that sourcing makes perfect sense when you think about it.
How so?
Well, in menopause, the ovaries stop responding to hormones. The brain senses this lack of ovarian activity and just screams louder, pumping out massive amounts of FSH and LH trying to get a response.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and that surplus is excreted in the urine, which we collect, purify, and give to infertile patients.
Nature's recycling program. And for a modern alternative, we have follitropins, like follitropin alpha and beta, which do essentially the same thing, but are manufactured using recombinant DNA technology.
Exactly.
But applying this level of direct, powerful stimulation to the ovaries introduces the most critical danger in this entire pharmacological landscape, which is ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, or OHSS.
OHSS is the ultimate red flag for a nurse managing these patients. The pathophysiology involves the ovaries suddenly and massively enlarging.
And that triggers severe fluid shifting in the body, right?
Yes. Rapid ovarian enlargement forces fluid to leak out of the vascular space and into the abdomen, creating ascites, or around the lungs, causing a pleural effusion.
So the patient is experiencing sudden severe pelvic pain, massive bloating, and shortness of breath.
Which is terrifying.
Right. The moment a patient reports those symptoms, the nursing action is immediate. You stop the medication. They will likely need hospitalization, strict bed rest, analgesics, intravenous fluid, and electrolyte replacement.
And in severe cases, you assist with a paracentesis to physically drain the trapped fluid from their abdomen.
Because the risk of OHSS is so high, the monitoring protocol for menotropins is intense. You can't just write the prescription and say, see you in a month.
No, not at all. These patients require an ultrasound every other day. You're meticulously measuring the follicles, waiting for them to reach a very specific size, 16 to 20 millimeters.
While simultaneously drawing blood to check serum estrogen levels, the target there is 200 picograms per milliliter for every maturing follicle.
Right. And the second those metrics align, you stop menotropins.
And let's not forget the twin factor here. This direct stimulation yields a 15% rate of twins and a 5% chance of 3 or more babies.
So let's follow the timeline. The ultrasound confirms you have perfect 18 millimeter follicles. The menotropins worked. The egg is mature, but it is physically trapped inside the ovary.
You need a trigger to force its release.
Exactly. Enter human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. Structurally, HCG is virtually identical to luteinizing hormone.
Okay, so by injecting it, we're simulating the natural mid-cycle LH surge that causes the follicle to burst.
Right, but the timing is mathematically strict. You administer the HCG exactly 1 day after the final dose of menotropins. Or, if you're using it as a backup trigger for a patient on clomiphene, you give it 7 to 9 days after their last clomiphene dose.
From a patient advocacy standpoint, it's vital to know how these are administered. The older urine-derived HCG brands like Novarel or Pregnol, they require a painful intramuscular injection.
Yeah, they're not fun.
But the newer recombinant DNA version, Gonadotropin alpha or Ovidrol, is given subcutaneously. A tiny needle into the belly fat completely changes the patient's physical experience of that day.
It makes a huge difference. So we have the trigger ready. But consider the flaw in this highly controlled environment. What happens if the patient's own brain decides to release a premature surge of LH before we give the HCG?
It ruins everything. The eggs are released before they're fully mature, the cycle is canceled, and all that time and physical suffering is just wasted. We need a way to put the brakes on the brain.
That is the exact role of gonadotropin-releasing hormone antagonists, specifically ganirelix and cetrorelix.
Okay.
These drugs literally block the pituitary from releasing any of its own premature LH. They lock down the system so the medical team has absolute total control over the exact hour of ovulation.
It's an incredible level of manipulation. Now, what about the patients whose cycles are blocked by something completely different? We mentioned hyperprolactinemia earlier.
Yes.
The drugs used here are cabergoline and bromocriptine, which are ergot derivatives and dopamine agonists.
You might actually recognize dopamine agonists from neurology, specifically for treating Parkinson's disease.
Wait, really? How does that cross over to infertility?
The connection lies in how the brain regulates its own secretions. Dopamine naturally acts as a brake on prolactin. If a patient has a pituitary adenoma pumping out excessive prolactin, it suppresses the gonadotropins, causing amenorrhea and infertility.
Ah, okay. So by administering a dopamine agonist, we're simulating the brain's natural inhibition. We hit the brakes on the prolactin, which takes the brakes off the gonadotropins, and the reproductive cycle restarts.
Exactly. It can even shrink the tumor itself.
That's amazing.
And between the two, cabergoline is vastly preferred. Bromocriptine requires daily dosing and causes significant nausea. Cabergoline is much better tolerated and is only taken twice a week.
But there is a strict safety alert here. Cabergoline is contraindicated in patients with uncontrolled hypertension. You must monitor their blood pressure at every visit.
Always.
So we've covered the anatomy, the biological tricks, the triggers, the brakes, and the dopamine connection. Let's pull this all together into the daily reality of nursing practice, focusing heavily on safety.
And the most immediate safety concern isn't just for the patient, it's for you, the nurse. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, has flagged clomiphene, menotropins, HCG, cabergoline, cetrorelix, and ganirelix as hazardous drugs.
Right, because these medications alter cellular reproduction and hormones. If you're handling them without proper protection, you are exposing yourself to reproductive harm.
You must follow hazardous drug protocols, specific gloves, gowns, and specialized disposal every single time.
Moving to lifespan considerations, you face a critical contradiction. The patient is there to get pregnant, but you must absolutely confirm they are not already pregnant before starting any of these therapies.
Yes. Drugs like clomiphene, menotropins, and HCG are highly teratogenic. They can cause severe developmental abnormalities and spontaneous abortions.
And if a patient is breastfeeding and seeking treatment for a subsequent pregnancy, caution is vital. Dopamine agonists, by their very design, decrease prolactin.
Right. So if you give cabergoline to a nursing mother, you will actively dry up her milk supply.
Finally, your role in patient education is paramount. The success of these medications relies on perfect timing. For clomiphene, you instruct the couple to have intercourse at least every other day during the 5 to 10 day window following the final dose.
And for menotropins and HCG, that window is even tighter. Intercourse must happen the evening before the HCG injection and for the 2 to 3 days immediately following it.
And through all of this, you are teaching them to monitor for OHSS. You explicitly tell them, if you feel sudden pelvic pressure, severe bloating, or shortness of breath, do not wait. Call the clinic immediately.
Because you are handing them massive biological power, and with that comes the responsibility of constant vigilance.
We've decoded the pharmacology, but before we wrap up this deep dive, consider the future of your role in this space. We're moving into an era where artificial intelligence can predict optimal IVF windows with terrifying accuracy, and synthetic hormones are becoming hyper-precise.
It really raises a profound question. As the technology takes over the timing and the biological guesswork, how does your role as a nurse evolve?
It's a huge shift.
Yeah, you transition from being an administrator of biology to a manager of expectations, ethics, and the psychological weight of engineered reproduction. When the science becomes flawless, the human element you provide becomes the most critical intervention of all.
Something to keep in mind as you head into your exams and out onto the floor. From the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We wish you the absolute best of luck in your pharmacology class. You've got this.